Cap sur la transition, heading for the transition. Let's focus on environmental public policies. This is the IDRI podcast. It's a debate that comes up every year and more specifically every summer, the place of tourism in our societies, or rather over-tourism. Today we will focus on a crucial sector from this point of view, the huge cruise market. Perhaps you have already boarded one of these real floating buildings, or should I say floating cities. The largest one, Icon of the Seas, sails between Florida, Mexico and the Bahamas. The cruise ship can carry more than 7,000 passengers and has 7 swimming pools, an ice rink, climbing walls, surf tracks, a theater, and dozens of restaurants. Can you imagine? This boat is longer than the Eiffel Tower. The cruise sector rebounded strongly after a pause due to the COVID pandemic. 2023 was a record year with 31.7 million passengers, including 27% new customers. And it's not over. Projections predict 40 million passengers by 2027, with more and more cruise ships and the large hotel groups entering the game. And yet, the impacts of this over-tourism are numerous, and we know them. Air and seawater pollution, to which must be added economic and social impacts. Blue tourism has many challenges to overcome to become sustainable, issues that we discuss today with Angelo Sciacca, Senior Research Fellow on Blue Tourism at IDRI and Project Coordinator of the Blue Tourism Initiative. Here we go. Hello, Angelo Sciacca.
Hello.
You conducted a study with a team of researchers to observe the challenges and opportunities of blue tourism. Let's start by discussing the impacts of these giant boats which cruise along the coasts. Those impacts are multiple, but we first think about the footprint on the environment.
It is quite significant, the impact of cruise tourism on the environment, since it contributes quite significantly to marine pollutions due to the large reliance on fossil fuels, the waste that is generated on board and then shipped on land, and the operational proximities of cruise tourism to coastal ecosystems, especially in high traffic areas like the Caribbean and the Mediterranean coast. And emissions from cruise operations ultimately contribute to acid rain, ocean acidifications, and climate change. There are also impacts from wastewaters that we should consider, which can introduce harmful bacterials, chemicals, and excessive nutrients into the ocean.
Solid waste is also an issue.
It is a major issue. Plastic, for example, can harm marine wildlife through ingestions and entanglement, and incinerated ash can add toxic pollutants into the water, such as dioxins and heavy metals. And I want to also to add that in addition to solid and wastewaters, cruises impact marine life through underwater noise pollution, which can ultimately interfere with the behavior of cetaceans, and also worth mentioning that through anchoring and dredging activities, cruise tourism has an impact on corals and seagrass beds. And decommissioned ships, that's another relevant issue. They are often dismantled in countries with often limited environmental regulations, releasing hazardous materials into the soil and water in these coastal areas.
Now, this was about environment. What about the economic impacts? We can figure that maybe it is positive, a sector in full growth, that means jobs, and the coastal economy must benefit for it, doesn't it?
Yes, they can be quite significant, even though the sector accounts for just 2% of international travels. And to mention some figures, in 2022, the industry supported 1.2 million jobs worldwide, contributing $130 billion to the global economy and generating $43 billion in wages. In some regions, where the sector has a predominant presence, the sector is particularly important and significant. For instance, in the Caribbean, it attracts 780,000 stopover visitors annually, and in Europe, the sector generates $44 billion into the economy and supports 350,000 jobs.
But does it also benefit to those who are on the land in these ports where the boats dock?
Actually, the economic benefits from cruise tourism can be unevenly distributed. So this is because the financial gains from the sector tend to remain concentrated among a very few stakeholders and ultimately affecting the economic multiplier in port destinations. There is also an issue related to the seasonal nature of the sector in many port destinations, which complicates the economic stability. And this is due to the high fluctuations of the number of tourists throughout the year.
And now the social impacts of the cruises industry, are they mostly negative or positive?
We can see both positive and negative impacts. So on the positive side, it can generate local employment opportunities. For example, in cruise tourism in Fiji, in 2018, it generated 4,000 full-time jobs. And the sector can also stimulate investments in essential infrastructure, such as ports, roads, and public amenities. On the negative side, the high tourist numbers during high season can disrupt local life, lead to excessive waste generation, traffic congestions, and increase in living costs. So all these factors can ultimately reduce the quality of life for residents. An example that we have seen in the news quite often comes from cities like Venice that have highlighted in recent years the tensions between locals and the cruise industry.
To deal with these impacts, is there any regulation, rules that would apply to everyone?
At the global level, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, leads the regulatory efforts for cruise tourism. And this is supported by conventions that seek to ensure safety, environmental protection, and level standards in the sector. Examples of these conventions are, for example, the MARPOL, which regulates pollution from operation and accidental causes, and the SOLAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea, which establishes a minimum safety standards for ship construction equipment and operation.
And is it doing the job? I mean, are those regulations and conventions effective, efficient?
Their successful implementation depends on the commitments and capacities of flag and port states. There needs to be robust enforcement and political will to implement the regulations. To help the effectiveness of these international regulations, regional agreements, and cooperation mechanisms are very relevant. For example, the Barcelona Convention for the protection of the marine environment and the coastal regions of the Mediterranean, or in the Caribbean, the Cartagena Convention, or the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, are in a position to promote sustainability in the tourism and then ultimately cruise tourism sector as well. So some progress have been made in past years, but more cooperation that is specific to cruise tourism is very much needed moving forward.
And cooperation at national and local level also?
At national, local level, regulations are quite relevant in terms of regulating maritime safety, pollution prevention, labor standards, and public health. But there are an issue in terms of resource disparities among national capacities in enforcing regulations, and issues also in relation to competitive pressure, where economic priorities often can overshadow strict regulatory compliance.
You mean different countries have stricter or weaker regulations to implement the standards for safety and environmental protection, even in the same region?
Yes, correct. So regulations can often be quite fragmented and inconsistent across countries, also within the same region. For example, open loop scrubber, which is a system that utilizes seawater to scrub the exhaust gases, essentially moving the pollution from air to sea, causing ocean acidification, is only banned in some countries. And it's also worth mentioning that cruises are responsible for 15% of scrubbers emissions, with the high concentration areas being the Caribbean, Europe, and the Malacca Strait. And this creates gaps that complicates the effective enforcement and sustainability measures. So even when regulations are in place, weak enforcement mechanism challenge the effectiveness, and insufficient resources for monitoring and enforcement can lead to non-compliance, ultimately allowing companies to potentially bypass sustainability measures that could mitigate environmental impact. And an additional one complicating factor is the flags of convenience, where cruise ships register in countries that are different of the country of ownership, and these countries where the cruise ships is registered may have softer regulations, weakening the international effort to promote sustainability and ensure compliance across borders.
Okay, let's talk about opportunities now. What could be done or shall be done to make cruise tourism sector more sustainable?
There are both regulatory and non-regulatory opportunities to consider. The most important is strengthening the sustainability in cruise tourism through enhancing global, regional, and national collaboration. So the collaboration here is really the key word that we should keep in mind moving forward. So it could be critical to establish a sector-specific governance mechanism to oversee the cruise sector's environmental and operational practices, to identify actions including ways to reduce emissions, improving waste management both on board and on land, and including ways to enforce compliance with the environmental regulations. Also, other opportunities include the role of ports, that key innovation hubs, where, for example, advanced waste management systems can be implemented to handle, recycle, and dispose waste that is generated by cruise ships. Let's also mention technological innovation, like alternative fuels to reduce emissions such as hydrogen, and real-time monitoring technologies such as satellite tracking systems and big data processing. So these technologies can provide up-to-date information on a ship's environmental performance, monitoring emissions, waste, and fuel consumption.
Okay, you're telling us that a more sustainable cruise tourism sector can be created. What policies should be implemented to overcome the challenges and get there looking at long term?
Well, it is essential to review the current regulations and to identify gaps and adapt them to the different regions, and improving communication and collaboration across different levels of governance. This kind of cooperation is particularly important to avoid destinations may lower their environmental standards to attract more cruise tourists. At the national level, governments must review their regulatory frameworks to ensure they are up to date. And this review should focus on areas such as socioeconomic resilience, environmental protection, and climate justice. Governments can further incentivize sustainable practices by offering tax reductions and subsidies for cruise lines that meet specific environmental standards. And there is also scope for vessel certifications that could become more rigorous and more aligned with international environmental standards.
That means everyone should pull in the same direction to agree on uniform regulations. When and where could these issues be discussed?
In particular, the third United Nations Conference on the Oceans, UNOC 3, to be held in June 2025 in Nice, co-chaired by France and Costa Rica, offers a relevant opportunity to achieve more cooperation both regionally and globally on cruise tourism, and more generally on issues around tourism. And we have hopes for the conference that could serve as a launching platform for specific commitments by governments and the private sector.
So we'll look after this conference, which will take place in Nice next June. Thank you very much, Angelo Sciacca. I remind the audience that you are a senior research fellow on blue tourism at IDRI. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
This is the end of this episode of Heading for the Transition, focused on the challenges of the expanding cruise industry sector to become more sustainable. I hope this has enlightened you. You can find and listen to all the IDRI podcasts on its website. Till the next episode, look after yourself and our planet.